actually, let me ask you something that I thought while Ali Razi was reporting. By bombing the factory where the Neptune missiles are made, the Russians are confirming that their lie is just that, a lie, that it was Ukrainian Neptune missiles that sunk their flagship, right?
That's a great point. That is an excellent point. I sometimes wonder why anybody ever believes anything that a Russian government official says at all. I mean, that we had to confirm it. It's great we confirmed what it was. But I think anytime we hear anything from them about what's happening on the battlefield, we should treat it as part of their disinformation tactics. But now it's been confirmed. We know why that ship sank. It wasn't because of some Russian mistakes. It was because of a Ukrainian victory.
Michael Crowley, take me inside. We've covered this as a new phase, and I feel like while we've been talking about a new phase has begun in Ukraine, and that new phase includes this, what's been described as saber rattling on the part of the Russians, and this more targeted strike on the weapons factory outside of Kyiv. A foreshadowing of brutality, which is interesting as a psychological tool of war, because the brutality in Bucha has already been revealed, not just to the Ukrainians, but the world. How is the administration sort of adjusting to the new phases on both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side?
Well, Nicole, the administration is just, stepping it up and pumping more weapons into Ukraine. And I think that the letter that the State Department received this week, it puts a fascinating, frame on the key question here, which is, where is Vladimir Putin's red line? Does he have one? Does he know what it is? I don't think the U.S. knows what it is. The point at which he says NATO and the West and the United States are giving Ukraine too much. This is I can't tolerate this. Too many Russian soldiers are dying. I'm at risk of losing. Because what we have seen in recent weeks is just this increased flow of weaponry to Ukraine as Russia beats a retreat, takes, incredible losses. Obviously, Ukraine is suffering enormously and tragically, but this has been basically a debacle for Russia. And at this point, I think if you had kind of looked into a crystal ball as an expert weeks ago, you might have said, well, Putin, maybe nearing the point where he's going to use a tactical nuclear weapon, or Putin by now would be striking NATO supply lines, possibly even striking into NATO territory, daring NATO to invoke Article 5. He's not doing any of that. I mean, at the moment, he looks like a bit of a paper tiger. So the answer to your question is the U.S. and the West is doing more and more. But I think the big question is whether and when Putin finally draws the line. Is there going to be some major retaliation? It could be a cyber attack. It could be a shot into NATO territory across one of the borders. No one seems to know, and that's the big shoe I'm waiting to see drop.
You write about these questions, Ambassador McFaul. I want to read from your piece in the Washington Post. Russia's army is struggling mightily in a war against a smaller and lesser armed Ukrainian army. Under such circumstances, Putin is highly unlikely to attack the largest military alliance in the world, anchored by the most powerful military in the world, the United States. Putin is angry and unhinged, but not suicidal. Biden and his national security team might have classified intelligence that suggests that these risks of escalation are greater than I can assess through open sources. If not, however, then the free world needs to provide Ukrainians with the quality and quantity of weapons to prevail in the Donbass. A Ukrainian win or stalemate in that battle will make us and our NATO allies more secure. A loss will produce the opposite. There are others with knowledge of the dynamics in the region and the stakes saying the same thing, that right now, Ambassador Bill Taylor is saying right now Ukraine needs to win. Tell me what that looks like and how short we are of doing for them what you call for in your piece.
Well, sir, first, two things. I mean, I think the red line that Michael's talking about, what is Putin's red line, is an essential question. And in my assessment, it's not about them attacking NATO, as you just read. It's not about a nuclear war with us. They rolled out Peskov and Medvedev to make that clear for us. It's all about whether or not he might use a tactical nuclear weapon or not in Ukraine. I'm skeptical that he would. I think the consequences of that are high, but we got to keep our focus on those red lines. On victory, I just want to make it crystal clear. If Putin wins, all of our allies in the region are going to be more threatened. all of our allies and partners in the Middle East and Asia will also feel more insecure, and if he loses, it's the exact opposite. And therefore, I do think there has been a change in the Biden administration. I talk to them fairly frequently, including just today, some senior Pentagon officials. I think they understand that, and they want to see a scenario in which the world can see that Putin gambled, he overreached. This is his Afghanistan. This is what Brezhnev did in Afghanistan. He overreached. And as a result, they're weaker, not stronger, as a result of this military intervention. And I think they're all in to achieve that outcome.
The administration, you think the Biden administration is all in to help the Ukrainians?
Well, with a couple of caveats, let me be careful. They have chosen, for instance, not to send MiG-29s, right? They have chosen not to send tanks, at least not yet. So they're drawing the line a little bit different than what I am, where I would. But generally speaking, the new kinds of weapons you have, the quantity, especially the long-range artillery that they just announced 2 days ago, Zelensky gave them a list, and they delivered on a lot of that list. Not all of the list, Zelensky would tell you, but they seem like they're leaning in as opposed to waiting. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the government in Ukraine was quite disappointed at how slow the United States and the West was moving. It feels like they've shifted because they understand the Battle of Donbass is where this war could be decided, and they want to help the Ukrainians as much as they can to win the Battle of Donbass.
Michael Crowley, the rhetoric used by President Zelensky is this sort of invisible weapon of war that the Ukrainians have, that they have used to just extraordinary effect. It will be studied for a very, very long time. I have paid a lot of attention to the words he's used. He was calling Putin a war criminal days and weeks before. But the American president, and I'm not suggesting it's causal, I'm saying they see these things the same way. They see Putin the same way. President Zelensky escalated and described what was happening in his country as a genocide. It didn't take President Biden long to see enough evidence that that was indeed what Vladimir Putin was doing in Ukraine, trying to eliminate the Ukrainian people, targeting civilians, decimating towns, reducing parts of the country to dust, using rape as a weapon of war. Zelensky today has asked the Biden administration to classify Russia and Vladimir Putin as a state sponsor of terror. What's the reaction?
Well, I think it rings true on some level. It's obvious that that Russia is terrorizing the civilian population of Ukraine. And by the way, I think you put your finger on something that's so essential. I don't think there's any way Vladimir Putin could have predicted the resonance that Zelensky as an individual leader would have in the West. I mean, this had to have completely blindsided him. No one else predicted it. No one in the West thought that Zelensky was going to develop this cult of personality, and it's been one of Ukraine's greatest assets. I mean, after Javelin missiles, it's Zelensky on streaming video. It's just been astonishing, and he has, as you have said, had a way of kind of shaping and leading the debate in the West. And I think this is a very, if I can say, clever new formulation. He's finding different ways to reframe Putin and Russia's behavior and get a conversation going in the West that keeps people engaged, interested, and outraged. And we haven't really kicked around this concept of terrorism, what it means in the context of a more conventional battlefield. Now, I can't tell you whether our terrorist designations would actually apply in a more conventional sense like the one we're seeing now. This, at least for me, is new ground. So I don't know what's likely to happen. But I think you put your finger exactly on the interesting thing here is that the skill he has had in framing these conversations, keeping them going. This is all tremendously to Ukraine's benefit because it maintains popular support in Western countries for the kinds of arms shipments we're seeing, and also a certain amount of patience. We'll see how long it lasts for these higher energy and other prices that are causing real disruptions.
And I mean, tragically, what President Zelensky has going from him is a terrorized population, a decimated swath of his country. I mean, the tragedy is that he's correct. So the rhetoric is only as powerful as it is because it's speaking this brutal, eloquent truth about what's happened to his country and his people at the hands of Vladimir Putin. And I wonder Ambassador McFaul, your thoughts about what this debate looks like inside our government about whether or not to consider designating Russia as a state sponsor of terror.
Well, Nicole, I run a international working group on sanctions. Academics like myself, a lot of former government officials, Europeans, Ukrainians. We met on Tuesday and we were discussing, we're going to have a paper come out on Monday. We're discussing exactly whether we should include this proposal from the Ukrainian government. And to your point about strategic communications, you know who Zoom bombed our call? President Zelensky. He suddenly showed up. And he wanted to encourage us to lean in to do that. Just to echo the point you're making about how I think they're incredibly smart about strategic communications. I'm with Michael. I don't know. U.S. government officials have briefed our group as well, just to be clear. I don't think they have thought through this systematically, but Zelensky is forcing the issue. We're talking about it right now. And eventually the Biden administration is going to have an answer for him.
Former Ambassador Michael McFaul, with a great anecdote about a Zoom bomb from President Zelensky, which perfectly makes all of our points better than any of us could. And Michael Crowley, thank you for all of your great reporting and for spending some time with us today. Today, there's new reporting about another batch of revealing texts that the January 6th House Committee has been analyzing. CNN is making public for the very first time messages to Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows from two of the ex-president's most loyal defenders in Congress, revealing just how Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Congressman Chip Roy of Texas privately went from aiding and abetting the big lie effort, including pitching Meadows' bogus plans from Sidney Powell and lawyer John Eastman, to begging him to turn up actual real evidence to back those plans up before ultimately voting against it all. Here we have the progression of Chip Roy in his text with Mark Meadows that CNN says it has seen. From Roy, the day Biden was announced as president-elect, in part, quote, "We need ammo. We need fraud examples. We need it this weekend." Meadows responds, quote, "We are working on exactly that." 2 days later from Roy, quote, "We must urge the president to tone down the rhetoric and approach the legal challenge firmly, intelligently, and effectively." On New Year's Eve, this, quote, "The president should call everyone off. It's the only path. If we substitute the will of states through electors with a vote by Congress every 4 years, we have destroyed the Electoral College." Respectfully. On January 1st, 2021, if POTUS allows this to occur, we're driving a stake in the heart of the Federal Republic. Neither the committee nor Meadows are commenting on that reporting, and NBC News has not independently examined those texts. Lee's spokesperson telling CNN that Lee, quote, "has been fully transparent," and Roy tweeting this afternoon he makes no apologies for his private texts or public positions. Joining us now, Luke Broadwater, New York Times congressional correspondent, who has new information about that Stephen Miller testimony we reported on yesterday, and Eugene Daniels, White House correspondent for Politico and co-author of Playbook, also an MSNBC contributor. Luke, just take me through what this evolution of Trump's allies says to you about the lack of evidence produced within the Trump coup accomplice circle.
Well, first off, credit to CNN for great reporting here and obtaining these email or these text messages, and we have been able to authenticate them. It does show a progression of two of Trump's most loyal followers in Congress. They start out very desirous that they want to push to try to overturn this election through whatever means they can. First, through the courts, offering up different lawyers, Sidney Powell, John Eastman. Then Mike Lee endorses the plan to use the so-called alternate electors or fake electors, to have states put forward these Trump electors. And then after effort after effort fails or ends up looking crazy, they both eventually back off and try to call everything off at the last minute. You just read those texts from Chip Roy where he says, "Call everything off. We're going to, drive a stake in the heart of the republic." And they both, when it comes down to it on January 6th, vote against overturning the election for Trump. So they do ultimately come out against these plans in the end, but only after trying multiple different paths to try to find a way that Donald Trump could stay in office before they reject them.
Let me dig in with you, Luke, to the Mike Lee text, because this date is interesting to me. On November 9th, Senator Mike Lee texts this: "I don't think the president is grasping the distinction between what we can do and what he would like us to do. I know only that this will end badly for the president unless we have the Constitution on our side, and unless these states submit new slates of Trump electors pursuant to state law. We do not have the Constitution on our side," he's saying. So he seems to have at least mental awareness and knowledge on the 9th that it is unconstitutional for the Congress to override the will of the voters. I wonder if that is important to the January 6th committee and if they've asked him for an interview.
I would think it would be quite important. You see him trying to draw a very slim distinction here between pressuring Mike Pence to overturn the election and pressuring the state lawmakers to put forward these electors for Donald Trump in states where he didn't win. I think most people would see that there's not much of a distinction there. Both are attempts to try to pressure people to defy the will of the voters. As for the January 6th committee interviewing him, I would not count on that. The January 6th committee was a House committee, and they seem to be very much following the traditions of Congress, where the House never talks to the Senate and a Senate investigation never talks to the House. I mean, they haven't even called in the Senate Sergeant at Arms or asked for Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley, who led some of these efforts to object to the election, for their testimony. So I would not count on them calling in Senator Lee. Chip Roy could be open to them asking him some questions, but again, they have been quite reluctant to call in House members as well. I mean, they've only sent letters to a few House members. So I would not anticipate that unless their stance changes tremendously.
And this is something Senator Mike Lee sends Eugene Daniels after the Powell-Giuliani presser. Interesting to see how sort of inside the Trump bubble it elicited this response. Senator Lee on November 19th, quote, "I'm worried about the Powell press conference. The potential defamation liability for the president is significant here. Unless Powell can back up everything she said, which I kind of doubt she can," to which Meadows writes this, quote, "I agree, very concerned." It's amazing to see that what we thought was, bat bleep crazy, one of Trump's closest advisors maybe did too.
Yeah, the thing is that the issue for the Senator Lee and a lot of other Republicans who texted or talked to members of the Trump administration at the time was the messiness in which this was going on, right? It wasn't that they were trying to overturn the will of the people. It was that it didn't look good. And they were talking about releasing the Kraken, and they were going too far. And it was starting to seem, like you said, a little crazy. And that was the biggest issue. And so as that continued, as Luke took us through kind of the trajectory of that, you started to see a lot of folks saying, you know what, I have to back up because I was with you when we thought you could work this in a way that didn't look as messy as it ended up looking. And I think that's something that's really important for folks to think about and remember for the future, is that if there is a way, if Republicans, some of these Republicans have shown an openness to some of this, right, giving the Trump team ideas on how to make this quote unquote legal and overturning the will of the people. And so if there's another team that gets the same kind of information or looks to this as a blueprint and doesn't have Sidney Powell or Rudy Giuliani doing a press conference or going to some of these states, then what do we have as a country? And that is something that I think is really important that we should continue talking about. And I know you, Nicole, has spent a lot of time talking about that, because looking for ways to do this in a way that isn't messy is something that I think some folks are taking pretty seriously.
Well, I mean, to me, it is insane that Lindsey Graham was calling Georgia, a state he doesn't represent, and reaching into a recount that had already happened twice. To me, it is insane that in the notes turned over to the Senate Judiciary Committee, before they were in the hands of the 1-6 committee, it is recorded that Donald Trump says to then acting AG, declare the election fraudulent and me and our buddies will do the rest. And it is equally insane to me that none of those Republican lawmakers have gone and shared, especially if they think they didn't do anything wrong. Why haven't they told their stories to the 1-6 committee, Eugene?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is because, we've all seen so much of this in public. And like Luke was saying, there has been a little bit of reticence on the committee's part to bring folks in because of how messy that would be. And I think more importantly, what kind of precedent that would set for the future, right? At some point, Republicans will be in charge of the committees in Congress. What kind of investigations will they throw in, and what kind of members of Congress will they want to come to the committee, and what's that going to look like? So that's something that Democrats have been thinking about a lot as this investigation has moved forward. But you're right, there was so much of the powerful people in this country, whether they be in the House or the Senate, or be connected to powerful people in this country who were in on this and following Donald Trump with this big lie, and that more importantly continue to do so. And so as the committee kind of draws down, or it seems like they might be drawing down, there's some stuff that we don't know. Maybe there are conversations that they've had with these members, but for the most part, it does seem like they have made sure to just kind of stay out of that, despite the fact that we know all of these things that you said were insane.
Well, and what the Republicans count on is what you're saying, that it's a norm-busting thing to ask members to come and talk to a congressional committee. But that just guarantees that they'll do it again, because they know the Democrats won't ask them to come talk to the people investigating. And I think the Democrats should call their bluff and say, we promise if we ever collude to overturn a democratically decided election, we'll come talk to you if you're in control. None of it makes sense to me from here. I'm going to ask both of you to stick around through a break, because Luke... We're back with Luke and Eugene. So, Luke, you have some great reporting on the January 6th committee's meeting with Stephen Miller. I want to hear all about it. I want to put a two-part question to you. One, you report that Miller invoked executive privilege when asked about the January 6th call with Trump and argued that the election had been stolen. He maintains the lie about the 2020 election result. And then there's this unbelievable bit of reporting in your story that says this: Mr. Miller rebutted the implication that the word "we" indicated that Trump was trying to incite the crowd to action, one of the people said, arguing that it had been used in political speech for decades, including by President John F. Kennedy in reference to the moon landing. Wow. Explain.
Yes. So the January 6th committee was pressing, the investigators on the committee were pressing Stephen Miller in this interview yesterday about Donald Trump's speech at the Ellipse on January 6th, where he encouraged the mob or what would become the mob, the crowd at the time, to march on the Capitol, to fight what he called election fraud, and to try to keep him in office. And so they kept asking, who was he talking to? What did he mean when he said "we"? Was this his intent? And so they were trying to get at whether or not he intended to incite the crowd. And Stephen Miller argued, according to our sources in this interview, that this speech was a normal speech. It was routine, and that it was using the sort of rhetoric that he compared to other great presidents at great moments in history. And he, argued with the committee. He pushed back and claimed the election was stolen. And, he claimed that this speech, there was nothing wrong with it. And so my understanding and now this is according to sources, we weren't sitting in the room, but that this at times was a quite combative and pugnacious interview.
So the problem with the actual claim itself, and I'll leave the nature of the witness alone, but the problem with the argument itself is that the facts belie the argument. Because once we marched on the Capitol, and at the time in the speech, the line says, "I will go with you." Once it turned violent, if he didn't mean we, will engage in medieval, brutal hand-to-hand combat that causes traumatic brain injuries and physical disabilities and leads to death by the Capitol police officers. There's a podium, there's a briefing room, and there are correspondents for every news organization in the world to go down and say, whoa, that's not what I meant. We will do. We all know Trump didn't do that. He didn't ever do that until his daughter and others begged him to make a lame video in which he said, we love you. So what about the fact problem that Stephen Miller's testimony represents, Eugene?
That's exactly right. All of the things you just laid out make it very hard to believe that this speech by itself was just a normal speech. It's almost impossible to believe, and it also doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? The speech itself that happened on January 6th is also connected to all of the behavior months before and after the election, where then President Trump was talking about the election was going to be stolen from him because of people were allowed to mail in their ballots after the election, the day of the election, talking about that. And so it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And the investigators know that. We know this. I mean, Stephen Miller knows this, that all of these things are connected. And it's a reminder to all of us, I don't need to remind you two, but it is a reminder to viewers that the committee is not just looking at what the actual actions on January 6th by that crowd, but everyone connected in the before and after of what happened on January 6th, because all of these things are interconnected.
Look, what is your sense of where the committee heads? I had Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren on at the beginning of the week, and I know they took some exception to the report that they'd reached this evidentiary hurdle, that if they wanted to make a criminal referral, they had enough evidence. But in the course of the interview, she confirmed the reporting that they had indeed reached that evidentiary hurdle. So what do they do now? They've got enough evidence, if they chose to make a criminal referral, to do so. What is the final, Eugene referred to sort of this final stage of the investigation. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think they are getting close to the end here. They're still doing something around 20, 30, 40 interviews a week, depending on the week. It's believed that they could wrap up at the end of this month. They've there's still a couple big names out there that they haven't called in and haven't announced a decision on that could be the final interviews. But they are in the closing stages here. We do know from their court filings, from our own reporting, that they do have a very strong case here. They may be bringing some people back in for a second interview or even a third interview to try to get a few more details out of them as they look to shore up this report. But then they're going to move to educating the public on what they've found. And so, I think close watchers of your show probably know this case very well, but there's a lot of people out there in the country who have turned off paying attention to January 6th. And so how can they bring back in those people and make them aware of their explosive findings once they're ready to release them? So I think that's their big question now.
And especially as we head toward another season of midterm elections and 2 years out from another presidential election. I know that's on Liz Cheney and others' minds. Luke Broadwater, Eugene Daniels, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. There have been some public-facing signs all week long that the January 6th committee is working overtime to fill in any remaining gaps in its investigation with new evidence and interviews. For Mark Meadows, the disgraced ex-president's ex-chief of staff, it appears his legal woes only began with the committee's vote to hold him in criminal contempt of Congress last year. Pressure is building on Attorney General Merrick Garland to act on that referral of criminal charges. Meanwhile, the text Meadows turned over to the committee before he stopped cooperating continued to reveal his outsized role in the coup plot that schemed to overturn President Joe Biden's legitimate victory in the 2020 election. Not to leave out a bombshell story we told you about earlier this week, a legitimate voter fraud investigation into Mark Meadows himself, whom NBC News learned was removed from the North Carolina voter rolls on Monday, citing, quote, documentation that indicated he lived in Virginia and last voted in the 2021 election there. Joining our conversation, MSNBC legal analyst Maya Wiley, civil rights attorney, and a former assistant U.S. attorney. John Hallman's still here. So Maya, I guess I'm old enough to remember how aggressively state attorneys general went after allegations of voter fraud and sought to criminally prosecute anyone. And it turns out most of the cases of voter fraud are people who fraudulently maybe were registered to vote on the Trump side. It's ironic and funny, but it's also incredibly cynical in that they have really no intention of prosecuting anyone in their own political tribe.
Well, Nicole, one thing that's true about voter fraud is it's very rare to see prosecutions of voter fraud because voter fraud itself is very rare. But I think here's the thing. We have been seeing cases of voters who are clearly intentionally violating law, who are white, who are getting probation. Of a woman in Iowa who voted twice. That was true of a man in Las Vegas who voted for his dead wife. Another man in Pennsylvania who registered his dead mother-in-law and his dead mother to vote and then tried to vote. So it's not that, I think what's shocking is that we're seeing efforts to find voter fraud. We're finding intentional voter fraud much more often with folks trying to push the line for Republicans. It's still hugely rare. But I think what's troubling to me is that, one, Mark Meadows, someone who's elected to Congress, someone who was working as the chief of staff to Donald Trump and helping to support the big lie, himself was apparently trying to demonstrate that the lie was truth by his own acts. I mean, this is a man who knew where he lived, who registered to vote at a trailer home that he did not own, and that the woman who did own it had no idea that he used her address, changed his voting shortly before the election. I mean, if you look at it from the standpoint of a prosecutor, it certainly looks like intentional voter fraud, at least if the facts prove what the news stories are saying, except that the people we're seeing being prosecuted and getting prison time are most often Black. And that's just important to point out here. It's like the law should apply equally to everyone, but that's not what we're seeing right now.
It's a reminder of a few things, that for the Trump side, it's never about what they say. They're not actually interested in voter fraud. They're interested in helping Donald Trump overturn a defeat. Now, we should point out that what NBC's reporting is that he's registered in 2 places, which is illegal. There's not evidence that he voted twice. But he has a real lawyer who's, I guess, ostensibly defending him in the January 6th probe, but he's going to face potential criminal charges for defying the subpoena. And then the DOJ investigation is squarely, just based on the text that we have seen, going to ensnare him as it involves the rally planning ahead of the insurrection.
Well, there's a couple things. First, it's not just that. Yes, it's true. It's always just all about Trump. So anything they're doing is always a pretext or a convenient tactic to try to serve that strategic interest. It's also a kind of a lethal combination of a thing that has nothing to do with Trump, which is Republicans fixated on voter fraud. It's like a trope for them, right? They're not concerned about voter fraud for real because there is no demonstrated voter fraud.
They're trying to overturn the real results.
Right. So there's all of it. It's the combination of the Trump, of the servile nature of all the people around Trump, really just trying to help do whatever they can do by any means necessary to help Trump, plus the employment of this kind of this fake tactic. But then there's the other thing that's very Trumpy about this to me, which is like, I just think maybe Mark Meadows, on the basis of what we're learning, I mean, I never thought he was a very good chief of staff, but like now with this, like this is the kind of thing that you know, there've been evil, malign White House chiefs of staff, power mad, narcissistic. We've had those before. Go back and look at the run that ran Nixon's White House. But like this one, the combination of the incompetence, the stupidity, the venality, and the stuff we were just talking about really puts Mark Meadows in a whole different class unto himself. It's like we're really finding out that he is going to be like the prima ballerina of disgraceful chiefs of staff of the history of the country. And, you know, we've all said Trump's like the worst president we've ever had. It turns out that of all the bad Trump's chiefs of staff, Meadows now takes the cake. And I think, you know, he deserves some kind of prize for that.
And there were so many to choose from. So it's not like
that's what I'm saying. There were like 34 of them, and none of them were any good.
So do you remember that Rolling Stone headline earlier in the week? I think it was fraud endorses quack. Yeah. We've got an update to that story on the other side of a break. Maya and John.